I'm Tay. I'm so glad you're here. Welcome back if you've been here before. Welcome if you're new. Today I'm going to be going through the 5 mistakes that I made last year with my first garden and what I'm going to do to change it this year. So let's get right into it. So the very first thing that I made the mistake of doing last year is not planning far enough ahead and planting my stuff too late. And the reason that I did that is because where I live, it's always kind of the rule of thumb that you don't plant anything until Mother's Day because that is right around the time when the last frost is expected to happen. And I don't obviously want anything to die. Well, I did not plant at Mother's Day. I planted about 3, maybe even 4 weeks after Mother's Day, which was just way too late. And my stuff did grow, but I had jalapeno plants that I bought when they were about 2 inches tall, and they grew till about 3.5 inches, maybe 4 inches by the end of summer. And I truly believe that part of the problem was that I did not plant it early enough. I did not give it the tender love and care that it deserved early enough. And so I literally got 2 baby jalapenos off of my jalapeno plants last year. And so this year, I'm really going to be paying attention to when you should be planting things. And the way that I'm going to be doing that is I actually went to almanaccom, and you can first off look and see based on your zip code when the last hard frost date is. And they typically say that you can plant stuff after the last hard frost date. But I'm actually taking it a step further because I found out that the almanac actually has a page where you can type in your zip code, and then it has all of the vegetables and the day that you can plant those outside. I do not start my own seeds inside. I don't start anything in my house. I go buy pre-grown plants from a local nursery, and that's what I plant. So my first step is planting the already grown plant outside in the garden. And so it has a column where it actually tells you based on what vegetable it is when you should be planting it. So that is how I'm going to be basing the day that I plant my vegetables in my garden this year. The second mistake that I made last year is I did not make my garden big enough. I remember having it tilled and I was like, oh my gosh, this is a huge garden. Like, what am I going to do? And then I decided to plant squash, and my squash plants did great. However, they took up over half of my garden, and I ended up having to throw vines into the yard, which my husband hated because then he couldn't mow right where they were at, and it was just a whole big mess. So one thing I am doing is I'm actually doubling the size, or almost doubling the size of my garden this year. And that way I know I'm going to have room for everything, because regardless of the squash plants, the other half of my garden that had my tomatoes and my peppers and everything, they were already planted way too close together when I very first planted them, without it even being because of the squash plants. And so by the end of summer, it was a chaotic mess. You couldn't get into weed, you couldn't really walk through it, and so you were like stepping on vines to get to the center tomatoes. And so this year I am going to also look up the distances that you're supposed to have between plants, and I'm going to try to make sure that I have that. That kind of goes into the third mistake that I made, and that is I planted tomatoes and I didn't put them on trellises. And so they basically grew across the ground, and so they were all laying on top of each other. And one, that was a problem because I already was lacking space. But two, it was a problem because there were tomatoes that grew on the underside, and they rotted before I had a chance to pick them, because I would literally have to pick up the plant off the ground to get to the bottom tomatoes. And so I am going to be planting all of my tomatoes on trellises this year. That way they grow up instead of out and across the ground. The fourth mistake that I made is that, like I said, I planted squash, and I didn't really pay attention to when you were supposed to pick squash, like when it is ripe. And I actually ended up waiting too long to pick my squash. I did pick 2 or 3 a little bit early, and I found that out when I cooked the first one, that it was a little bit too soon. And so I was like, okay, I'll wait. Well, then I ended up waiting a little bit too late, and we ended up getting a super early frost, and it actually made a lot of them disgusting. So I had these 2 huge giant squash plants that produced a ton of squash, and we only got maybe 3 or 4 squash that we were able to eat because of my lack of knowledge, preparation, whatever you want to call it. I just didn't know what the heck I was doing, and they all went bad. And the fifth and final mistake that I made with my garden is, like I said, last year was the first year that I had my garden. I did not do raised garden beds. My garden is just in the ground. And we had a family friend of ours come and actually till the garden for us. And one thing that I did not expect is how quickly the grass would try to come back into the garden. Like, I obviously knew that I was going to have weeds, but I wasn't expecting the grass to super aggressively come back. And so one thing that I did do after he tilled it is I did spray it with weed killer, and it was like a garden friendly one, which potentially I guess maybe is why the grass came back so bad. But you know, I was planting food in there, so I didn't want anything super crazy. But I did spray it with weed killer, and then I waited a couple weeks before I planted stuff. And you know, that helped with the weeds a little bit, but not a whole lot. I also used a little bit of preen. I will be trying that again this year because I do think that it worked. However, the main problem was that I did not weed right before we went on vacation. We went on vacation for a week, and then when we came back, there was grass everywhere in my garden, and it was big enough that I would like pull up the clumps, and it would like pull up the plants that I had planted. And so I ended up having to leave some of the grass in there because I didn't want to kill the plants that I had already planted. There's probably another way to do that. Another mistake that I made with the grass is that because he tilled it just in our grass, I didn't go through and take out the big chunks of sod that were left. I just thought that I could weed kill them and they would be fine. So I think what actually happened was that some of the big chunks of sod actually just continued to grow because even though they were moved and tore up, they had enough roots that they just kind of reattached where they were, and then they started growing again. So when I extend my garden this year, it will be just in grass, and I am going to go through a lot more carefully, take out the big pieces of grass. I will probably weed kill again, and then I will also make sure that I am way better on top of it when it comes to pulling weeds, pulling the grass, and I will weed right before we go on vacation. Like I said, this is only my second attempt at a garden ever, and so basically everything that I did last year was wrong. I did get some vegetables, but it was not nearly as good as I was hoping for, as I was expecting, as I would like it to be this year. And so I really hope that telling you about the main 5 mistakes that I made last year will stop you from making them if this is your first garden, if this is your 10th garden. I'm assuming you already know all of these things, you've already learned all these tricks. So this is mainly for the people who this is your first time gardening, second time gardening, and you're trying to figure out, you know, what went wrong. I hope that this was so helpful, and I'm so excited that you were here. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye.